All right, so we're going to start talking about World War II, starting in 1939. Um, we've talked a little bit about the precursors of World War II, leading up to the actual attack on Poland, but this is when the war officially starts in Europe. Germany takes the rest of Czechoslovakia. I think it's September 1st, 1939, and then they invade Poland. World War II officially begins at that point because Britain and France have to uphold the Munich Pact, and then they declare war on Germany. They had said to the Germans in 1938 that if the Germans continued to be aggressive or had occupied any more territory, they would have to uphold the Treaty of Versailles, and then eventually they would have to uphold this Munich Pact that they signed in 1938. And so this is when World War II begins, and Britain and France declare war on Germany for breaking their word that they gave a year before. Germany then felt like they were in a position where they could take on the Brits and the French pretty easily at that point. They had built, a really strong army. They had a technological advantage. Their economy was, kind of running full boom at that point, and their blitzkrieg that they had tried out in the Spanish Civil War and a lot of the other tactics they had tried out in the Spanish Civil War proved to be very successful in these early stages. So Germany felt like they had the upper hand to help things. And if you look at the first kind of bullet, Germany signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. So as soon as they broke the Munich Pact with the West, they signed this non-aggression pact with Eastern European superpower, the Soviet Union. And this pact was good for both countries. They decided they were going to split Poland in half. So the Soviets would attack the eastern half of Poland, and the Nazis would attack the west. So they'd split it right down the middle. The Nazis agreed to buy fossil fuels, so coal and oil, from the Soviet Union, which gave the Soviets a much needed cash infusion. And then basically Stalin and the Soviets said to Nazi Germany, you can go after the rest of Western Europe, which included France and Netherlands and Denmark and Belgium and England eventually if they wanted. And then the Nazis said to, Nazis and Hitler said to Stalin and the Soviets, you can go ahead and attack Finland, which would give the Soviets a warm water port, and you can fight a secret war against Japan. So on the down low, the Nazis gave the Soviets approval to go after Japan. And if you were paying attention in Dr. Zhivago, this is where Victor is going in the film, where the Soviets are actually fighting the Japanese in kind of Manchuria and Mongolia in that area. So it had to be an undeclared war against Japan because the Nazis had other agreements with the Japanese, but basically the Nazis undermined both countries and allowed them to kind of have it out against each other. And you guys know, because of the Russo-Japanese War, that the Russians, Soviets now and the Japanese didn't have a lot of love for one another. So they were fighting this secret war on the frontier for a long time. The Soviets then, do go ahead and, fight this undeclared war against Japan and invade Finland, and they're successful. They get their, warm water ports up there on the White Sea. The Finnish actually put up a pretty good resistance, and, I'll probably talk a little bit in class about some of their snipers and the guys that held off the Soviets, but eventually Finland succumbed to the Soviet invasion. Italy in 1939 takes advantage of this kind of infusion of fascist power. They invade Albania, and eventually they invade Greece as well. Italy, during World War II, had a pretty good tradition of only going after countries that were weak and unarmed. Albania fit the bill, Greece fit the bill, Ethiopia fit the bill, and that was kind of Italy's story. They were allies with the Germans, but they were never nearly as powerful as the Germans in World War II. The Spanish Civil War ends. Francisco Franco wins. He's another fascist sort of ally of Hitler in Europe. what Hitler didn't know is that Franco backstabbed him by cutting a deal with Franklin Delano Roosevelt to do some secret shipping through the borders of Spain into France, especially once the French were occupied by the Nazis, which was coming in 1940. 1940 was a banner year for fascists and Nazis everywhere. The German blitzkrieg took most of Western Europe. They took Denmark, Norway, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Belgium, and they took France in 40 days. And that's really significant because of what had happened in World War I. So the Germans had fought to a stalemate against the French and the Brits in France for 3-4 years in World War I. And eventually, the French, along with their allies, the Americans and the British, were able to kind of punch through and beat the Germans in World War I, which was a crushing, psychological, emotional, and military defeat for the Germans. So for them to come back and beat the French in 40 days was, significant, and it was, shocking to the rest of the world. How quickly and how decisively the Nazis were able to beat the French at the beginning of World War II. And the French, stayed under Nazi occupation for the next 4 years, next 5 years. And it was very difficult, for the British, because once France was under the control of the Nazis, they were the next frontier. So the Brits remained under constant threat of the Nazis after France was occupied in 1940. The United States did not want to get into World War II at that point, or at least the people of the United States did not want to get involved in World War II. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the president of the U.S. at the time, knew that the United States was eventually going to have to get involved, and they were probably going to get involved, certainly going to get involved on the side of the British. So the U.S. signed this Lend-Lease Act with Britain in 1940, and basically what the Lend-Lease Act was the U.S. would sell weapons and ammunition to the British, and they would also lease them strategic areas throughout the globe where the British could kind of more successfully fight their war against the Germans. At the end of the day, the United States didn't make the British pay for what they leased them or lent them. And it really was just a way of the United States to support Britain while the U.S. population was kind of coming around to the realization that they were going to have to support, the British in this side of the war anyway. They just weren't, politically or, psychologically ready to jump into the war at that point. Naval warfare began between Britain and Germany. The USA actually played a peripheral role here. U.S. planes would actually go up and spot German targets, and then the British would blow them out of the water. There's two reasons why the U.S. took on this role. Number one, they sort of knew that they were going to have to fight the Nazis eventually anyway, so any Nazi ship that went down was good for the United States. But secondly, they were trying to kind of bait the Nazis into firing at American planes. By doing this, then the Americans would have a reason to declare war against the Nazis. And FDR really felt like they needed to get into the war sooner than later. They didn't want Britain to fall, because if Britain fell to the Nazis, then the U.S. would have a much harder time kind of getting into Europe and getting rid of the Nazis. So in a sense, the U.S. really wanted to get involved in this thing before the Nazis were able to invade Britain, which they never did. But it was, touch and go, certainly in 1940 and 1941. Germany and Japan and Italy eventually solidified, and they signed their own pact called the Axis Pact in 1940. And all three of the major fascist powers in the world were united at this point to kind of beat back any challenge from anybody. The Spanish did not sign into this pact, even though they had a pseudo-fascist government. So they kind of remained, supporters of this Axis Pact, sort of, but never really involved, by signing their name on the dotted line. 1941 was a real big turning point in World War II. Operation Barbarossa was this kind of was when the Germans attacked the USSR, and it was very similar to what we learned about in regards to Napoleon attacking Russia. The Germans were able to make steady, good progress right into the USSR. They made it to the gates of Moscow, and all the while they got further and further, deeper and deeper. Away from their source of supplies, their source of fresh soldiers, their source of warmth and comfort and whatever. And all the while, the Soviets burned villages and slaughtered cattle and tore up railroads and blew up bridges to make it harder and harder for the Germans to ever make it back to Germany. There was death and destruction on a massive scale. And just like with Napoleon, once the Germans got to Moscow, the winter hit. They were, the Soviets were able to kind of mount an offensive in their general, put their soldiers on cross-country skis, and they attacked the Germans and harassed them for the next 3 or 4 years. And I'll give the details in class, but what you need to know is that the Germans made the same mistake as Napoleon made, which was getting too far into Russia, the Soviet Union, becoming isolated, getting beat up by the elements and by the conditions and by lack of supplies. And they were never the same after their attack on the Soviet Union. What's kind of even more remarkable about this is that Hitler didn't need to do it, right? He had a pretty good pact with the Soviet Union where, Stalin wasn't going to harass him and he wasn't going to harass Stalin. So by breaking that pact, in a sense, Hitler sealed his eventual fate. Other things in 1941, the Royal Air Force, the British equivalent of our Air Force, resisted Nazis 24/7, 365. So they flew bombing raids over strategic German areas, depots, supply depots, factories, railroads. And they harassed the Germans just enough to keep the Germans away from invading the British or England. And so the RAF resistance was integral to kind of holding the Nazis at bay, combined with the Nazis kind of spreading themselves out and fighting this second front on the Eastern Front against the Soviets. In 1941, late 1941, in January 1941, the USA eventually declared war against Germany after Pearl Harbor. So the Japanese attacked the U.S. at Pearl Harbor, and we'll talk about that later. But the Germans, being part of this Axis Pact, had to declare war on the United States as well. And so this was in December 1941. And then the last thing I'm going to say about 1941, and then we'll give another break in the notes, is that the Germans invaded North Africa under their famous general, the Desert Fox, Rommel. And they invaded North Africa so that they could march east and get into the Middle East and exploit the oil fields of the Middle East. Because just like Russians always want warm water ports, the Germans are always in need of fossil fuel. So Hitler and the Nazis knew really early on they needed to get into the Middle East, and their surest way was down through North Africa so that they could march east and grab the Middle East, which was under the control of the British at the time. The Middle East has its own, set of countries and everything else now, but it was at that time just occupied territory of England. So we'll end it there, and we'll